This meeting is being recorded.
So we are being recorded.
Diane, you might also ask people to mute because there's a lot of background noise.
Sure, I can start maybe by, there's probably people that I'm not seeing here because you see there's 2 pages. So, wow, there are a lot of people online. Let me just tell you, there are 52 people online. I'll see if I should be able to mute them all, shouldn't I, at once?
Now, build the Morehouse family a new home. We reached Nancy Morehouse in Digby County, Nova Scotia.
Nancy, can you recall the number?
Okay, I think, can you hear background noise now, Susan?
Yes.
It seems very quiet to me. Okay, just one more second.
I don't know.
I think the audio is fine, but I've turned people off. I've tried to mute everybody, just so that we don't have any background noise. So maybe you can just raise your hand if you maybe enter a chat if you find that there is background noise. Eric is still having trouble with his audio. I don't know if Eric, you can hear us or not. Okay, I'm going to, if people find that I'm putting you on mute, I apologize if that seems rude. I just feel like we need to be able to make sure that things are quiet and so that everybody can hear the speaker. So if I see somebody that's not on mute, I'm just automatically putting you on mute, and I'll continue to monitor that. Thank you very much, everyone. It's good to see so many people here. It's a lovely, big group of people. Most people I see their names and not their persons, but I understand that. I did notice earlier Robin was knitting, and I was going to suggest that I'm a knitter and a crocheter, and I bet you a lot of people have things that they like to do with their hands, knitting, crocheting, and all kinds of other things. And there's some research around, from a psychological perspective, there's research that shows that people actually can attend and listen and learn well when they have something to do with their hands, at least some people. So feel free to do that. I mean, if you like to draw or whatever it is that you'd like to do, please feel free to not have to hide your knitting under your desk. It's a good hobby and something that we can do while we're sitting around. This evening, I'm very pleased to welcome Hilary Mann as our guest speaker. Hilary's gotten to know the birds of the Maritimes while researching and monitoring shorebirds on the Bay of Fundy, seabirds on Country Island, Ipswich Sparrows on Sable Island, and swallows on farms throughout New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. There's a few of us that are a little jealous, Hilary, of your what you have going on as far as your apparent work. It looks like enjoyable work. I'm sure it's hard work as well, but especially Sable Island must be a very special place. The title of Hilary's presentation tonight is Going, but Not Gone Yet, Insight into Recent Research on Barn Swallows in the Maritimes. Hilary will talk about how the places barn swallows call home impact their success. And sorry, folks.
On the side of your phone, does that make any difference?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the muted people who need to mute. So Hilary's going to talk about the places barn swallows call home, how that impacts their success, why we still have lots to learn about the species, and what you can do to help ensure that these aerial acrobats will be around for generations to come. Hilary completed her master's degree at Dalhousie University, researching barn swallows in 2021. Congratulations, Hilary, that's quite an accomplishment. And is now working with Phil Taylor at Acadia University to better understand bird movements in the region. When not at her computer working with data, Hilary is most likely hiking and sharing fun facts about all the birds along the trail with unsuspecting friends. Hilary, we really appreciate that you've graciously agreed to spend another hour in front of Zoom when you could be hiking. Thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing more about the barn owls. So with that, I'll let you take it. I'm just going to make sure that you can share screen. That's great. Thank you.
So all those are turned off.
Can you just confirm? Oh, one moment. Okay. Can I confirm that you're able to just see the first slide at the moment? Okay,
We can
perfect.
see your whole presenter view actually.
Interesting. Okay, we'll just do this.
Okay, sorry.
How well my memory serves me. No, thanks for the heads up and thanks for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here today to share my love of swallows with you tonight. I'm no longer specifically working on barn swallows, but they definitely hold a special place in my heart, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. And also 2020 is a good year to kind of review what's happened, because there's been pretty consistent monitoring and research on swallows in the region since about 2012. So it's kind of a like 10-year anniversary that we can somewhat celebrate right now. There we go. So I want to first stress that I am just one person who has been working on these species. There are a lot of other people involved and a lot of people who have put so much work into this that I just want to recognize off the bat. So first of all, some of you may recognize Dr. Tara Imlay. She completed her PhD research on swallows in the Maritimes, looking at causes for their declines for 4 swallow species. And she was the person who first introduced me to barn swallows. I was an assistant on her PhD research, and she kind of shared her love of barn swallows and all her knowledge, and she's been a fantastic mentor and has led a lot of the research that I will be talking about today. We also have Dr. Marty Leonard, who is a professor and dean at Dalhousie University, who was a supervisor to both Tara and myself, and who provided invaluable insight into conservation and research, and was also an incredible mentor and really played a huge role in this research. We also have a couple people at Canadian Wildlife Service, Becky Whittam and Peter Thomas, who both have been really important figures in either starting out some monitoring work or supporting this research along the way. And then there have been so many different research assistants and field assistants who have helped collect all the data. But there are 2 in particular, Becky Jardine and Katie Mcguire, who were the field assistants for my master's research field seasons, and who just like the experience would have been quite different without them. And I am very grateful for their involvement and all of their help for this project. And so what united us all was our love for these aerial acrobats, barn swallows. Barn swallows are an aerial insectivore, which is a group of birds that is united by their diet for insects. And in particular, they eat insects while in flight. And so this means that they're all quite acrobatic, and you get these characteristic kind of swooping and diving and just like very acrobatic flights. This is especially true in the barn swallow, which have a characteristic forked tail that make them especially agile in the air. Now, as members of the Bird Society, you very likely already know barn swallows, but even for non-birdie people, they likely know the species, and not just in Canada, because barn swallows are found at least some point in their life cycle on every continent except for Antarctica. They're very widespread. They're kind of a species of least concern internationally because their numbers are quite high. And they're such distinctive birds that people just generally know them. And not only are they just like incredibly common, but they are really common in our culture. You see them in a lot of artwork and books on jewelry and clothing, and you often see tattoos of them. They also play a big role in a lot of mythology and folklore from places around the world. They're indigenous groups in the US that talk about how it got its forked tail by stealing the sun. They are a sign of spring in old times in Europe, where their arrival in the springtime would be worthwhile to announce to the whole village as a sign of kind of what's to come. And you also find tales of them being both good and bad omens if they nest on a house, and lots of really interesting kind of medicinal properties for them. And yeah, there's just kind of endless stories about them being present in our culture in the past. So one of the reasons why they're so intertwined with our culture is just how dependent they are on humans at the moment. So in the past, they would have these natural nest sites like you see on the left. It's really hard to see the nest in this photo, which it makes sense because they want to be hidden from predators, but there's kind of a mud cup tucked under the lip of the cliff there. So that's how they used to nest. But then once people started building structures, they started to transition to building their nests inside or associated with these structures. There are records from the early 1800s of them nesting on structures built by indigenous people in North America. And now they are almost entirely dependent on barns or sheds, culverts, or just other structures to build their nests. So now what you see with these swallow nests is what you see on the right, where most of the time they're up in the rafters of buildings. See if the slide will move. So these are very typical of what you will see for barn swallow nesting sites now. They like to have relatively sheltered areas, so they'll actually go into the barn. They'll go up high to be out of reach of predators, and sometimes very high. They're often associated with animals like alpacas here, but often livestock. And you see them a lot in rural areas and farms. But you can also get some more atypical nesting sites. So on the left, this is one of those like big salt domes, the pyramid shaped brown buildings that you see on the side of highways sometimes. This is the one up in Fredericton actually, and you can see Katie here for scale. It's a massive building, and there's actually about 10 pairs that nest there now, and you see them darting in and out in the summer. And so that's not typically this spot where you would expect to see swallows, especially because there's a Costco just right across the street from there. Some of you might have also been to the Rona in Upper Tantallon before, where I know every summer there are barn swallows nesting in the kind of big open area there that you can go and see swooping in and out. So even though barn swallows are often associated with these really rural areas, farms and cows, you can find them in places where you might not expect. They can be quite flexible. I also want to take a minute to make sure that we just make sure there isn't any confusion between what swallow I'm talking about. So there are 4 main swallow species that we see in the Maritimes and in Nova Scotia. We have the barn swallow, which I've introduced. We have the tree swallow, which is much more kind of iridescent blue with white underneath, and nests primarily in these nest boxes that you can build. I'm sure many of you have them or have seen them before. We also have bank swallows, which you can see in the middle. They're the ones that dig burrows into kind of soft cliff faces. And they're a smaller and kind of a more dull uniform brown than barn swallows. And then lastly, we have cliff swallows, which you can see on the right. Now, these are the ones that are most likely to be confused with barn swallows because you'll often find them nesting in the same building. The difference being that cliff swallows, they'll generally be outside of the building on the eaves with these nests that are more closed in generally, whereas the barn swallows will actually be the ones kind of swooping in through doors and windows and building more open cup nests. But all of these are united in that they're aerial insectivores and they face a lot of common problems, but yeah, I'll just be focusing on barn swallows for now. So despite the fact that everyone knows barn swallows, they are very common. They have experienced quite dramatic declines, especially when we look at Canada, where they've declined about 70% since 1970. And these declines are even more exacerbated if we focus in on the Maritimes. So since 1970, you can see in this graph, this is looking at their abundance based on breeding bird surveys. Between 1970 and about 1995 or 2000, you see this like really dramatic drop and then a relatively stable population after that. But this is a really concerning trajectory. This really suggests that something went quite terribly wrong, and it suggests that the barn swallows are quite in trouble. We can look at the breeding bird atlas to see how abundance has changed kind of spatially in the Maritimes as well. And it's quite the stark difference between the first atlas, which took place in the late 80s, and the second, which took place in kind of the late 2000s. So back in the 80s, it was like fairly common to see barn swallows pretty much anywhere you were in the Maritimes, with the exception of some higher altitude areas like the hills in northern New Brunswick or up in the highlands in Cape Breton. But the shift was quite dramatic. Now you really have to be in pockets to reliably see barn swallows, places like the St. John River Valley, Tantramar area, or the other pockets in Nova Scotia. And so these changes in their population are likely due to a combination of a variety of different threats. So we see declines in insect populations are a very likely cause, in part due to pesticide use, as well as general habitat loss. The loss of wetlands or fields is really important for barn swallows because they really rely on these habitats to be sources for their insect prey. But also we can think of the loss of habitat for their breeding sites. So on the right is a picture of the Tantramar marshes from, well, I actually do not remember what time period this was from, but it's from the archives. And I would say maybe at least 30 or 40 years ago. You can see these are all the marsh barns that used to be out on the marshes to dry hay in. Now I think there's about 3 of these left in the whole marsh area. And this is kind of a common theme in looking at the presence of suitable nesting habitat for barn swallows. We see the loss of a lot of like small family farms, a lot of old barns falling down, a lot of kind of newer, more enclosed barns being built. All of this all of this relates to the loss of habitat they really need to thrive. And also climate change has likely played a role in their declines, especially by creating more unpredictable weather, and including cold snaps or heat waves that really make reproducing and just survival in general a lot more difficult for them. So in response to these declines, in 2011, the barn swallow was listed as a threatened species nationally by the Species at Risk Act. And so this is a process that goes through a kind of expert panel, and this provided an extra level of protection to the barn swallow, in addition to what protections they already receive as a migratory bird. And so in 2013, the province of Nova Scotia followed this up by listing them as an endangered species provincially, which really recognized how dramatic their declines were in the area. But something interesting that happened just last year in 2021 was that federally, the status as a threatened species was removed, and instead the barn swallow is now a species of special concern. So that means that they lose some of the protections that usually come with being a species at risk. And this is an interesting thing, because if we look back at this graph, the nationwide patterns are quite comparable to what we see here. We haven't seen recovery in the populations, really. We see this relatively stable period from about 2000 to 2019. And that ends up being why they have been classified now as a species of special concern. Because in the assessment process, they only really look at the previous 10 years of abundance data to make their decisions. And so what this means is that because on a national level, the trends have been relatively stable in the most recent period of time, they aren't seen as that much they aren't seen as much in trouble. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is great with the species. There's still a lot of concern about why these declines occurred and kind of why there hasn't been recovery since, and also what we can do to help us reach a point where their populations do start to improve again. And so that leads us to kind of two of the main questions that we've been asking for the last 10 years out here, and that we've been trying to figure out what caused these declines and also what is happening right now with this species. And so this team of researchers came together to address these questions. And we looked at these questions using a variety of different methods. And so one thing that we did was we used banding at the breeding colonies to be able to track when birds are returning year after year. And so in the picture on the right, you can see that on the birds, well, on the leg on the left, the bird's right, there's a very little metal band. Now, these bands, unlike the ones you see on larger birds, it's nearly impossible to read this band. The swallows have such short legs anyways that when they're perching, it's hard to see it through the feathers, but the numbers on the bands are quite difficult to see as well. But this is still really useful for us because we're able to put this little band on and then return to a colony next year and see if this bird has returned. We also used a variety of different types of tags to track the birds to see where they go and how they're moving around. Tara also led some of these really interesting analyses of feather and blood samples from birds on the breeding grounds, because you're able to look at the stress hormones or other physiological markers in these tissues to answer questions that would otherwise be really, really difficult to answer. And so I'll be talking about that a bit more later on, but it's something that I find really interesting. And lastly, a major component of what has been done for the last 10 years and a major component of my project was monitoring breeding activity at different barn swallow colonies in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So some of my fondest memories of doing my research come from this monitoring. So what we would do is we would get this kind of extendable painting pole and duct tape a bike mirror, or we upgraded to an inspection mirror, which was a game changer, and put it up above the nest. Now, I do want to stress that this is not something that you should do. This is something that was done with a lot of special permits, and it is something that does cause some disruption to the birds. And so we do this with specific questions in mind to learn specific things, but you should, I know a lot of you know this, most of you will know this, but please do not go looking at nests, touching nests. You can admire from afar. But it was really interesting to do this because we would get ourselves into some really interesting situations. A lot of the places where we would monitor these birds were on kind of cattle farms or other sorts of farms where there was really endless amounts of manure. And so I think everyone who worked on this project at some point ended up with a boot stuck in the mud and you're standing there with a sock foot kind of ankle deep in manure. Some of the nests were quite high up, but you know, we really wanted that data still. And so sometimes we would get into slightly precarious situations. But we try to not show our supervisors too much of those photos. And also the fact that we were working on a lot of cattle farms meant that the cattle were a constant presence Sometimes we would need to shoo them out of a barn to check a nest that they were lying under. Sometimes they would be very cooperative and would just let us sneak in around them. Sometimes they were very interested, overly interested in us and the pole, licking the pole, coming to us very excitedly, which was not always the most welcome. But in general, it was a really fun experience where we would visit in these different farms every 2 to 3 days to keep track of what was happening in the nests. Another perk of this monitoring was all of the other animals at these farms, the puppies, the dogs, the horses, the alpacas, including the baby bottle-fed alpaca, Dylan, and the sheep. It was a really, really wonderful experience as an animal lover that, yeah, I miss it a lot to be able to just play with these animals on a regular basis. But what this monitoring did was provided us a really invaluable record, a very specific idea of the timing of breeding, as well as measures like the number of eggs that were laid, the date of hatching, how many hatched, and later on how many made it to 12 days old, which is when we stopped monitoring so that we wouldn't force the chicks to leave the nest early, which they typically do when they're about 19 days old. So you can see in these photos here on the left, there's some eggs in the nest. I see 3 there. There could be more. And then on the right, you see a little pile of chicks. Those are probably about 7 days old. You can try to count them. There's probably about 1, 2, there's definitely 4. There's probably a 5th in there. But we spent a lot of time really trying to distinguish between individuals, because when they're little pink blobs, they can be a bit difficult to distinguish from one another. And so what we were able to do with all this data that we collected was first look at what caused the declines in the populations. And so it's really difficult to find data a lot of the time for looking at kind of historical declines. But something that we're really lucky with is there's this Maritime Nest Record Scheme and Project Nest Watch, which has a long-term record of breeding data that's collected by different research projects as well as citizen scientists. And so what we're able to do with this is actually kind of retrospectively look at the data of what was happening with reproductive success and timing over many years. So Tara led this project looking at these changes over 57 years. And it really was quite the impressive undertaking to have such a long-term data set and really provided invaluable data. Some of the highlights that she found was that barn swallows are breeding 10 days earlier now than they were in it was the late 60s, I believe that was the initial period that they looked at. So that's a really substantial shift in the timing of their breeding. And that is likely indicative of changes in climate. However, we did see that now there is lower nest success than there was in the past when populations were higher. So that could be a reason why, that could be in part a reason why populations decline if fewer of the nests are able to actually produce young. But in general, she saw little change in reproductive success over time. And this really suggested that, you know, breeding success, like a reduction in breeding success, could have played a role in population declines, but likely wasn't a major source of change. But one thing to keep in mind is that this analysis didn't take into account multiple brooding. So multiple brooding occurs in only some of the barn swallows here. And it is when a bird will successfully raise one brood of young. And then in the same year, it will go on to restart nesting and raise another set of young. And so this is a really interesting behavior because it can potentially double the number of young that a bird will produce in a year. But it is also very energetically costly. Think about all the effort, all the trips to feed the young that the swallow took with the first nest, and now they're doing it again. And so in general, this is done when the adult is in good condition, when there's ample food supplies around, and when conditions are just generally good to have the time to raise 2 clutches of young. We unfortunately don't really have historical records of this behavior because it's really hard to distinguish between, say, a late nesting bird, a second brood, or a re-nest of a bird that had failed. And so this is something that we can really only capture by some of the intensive nest monitoring, like what we did for the last 10 years. And that ended up being what I did for a portion of my master's thesis, is looking at this multiple brooding behavior. And that brings us to the question of what is happening now with barn swallows. And so one of the big questions for my thesis was, when do barn swallows have more multiple broods? Because we really want to figure out what is making these like good breeding conditions now that will end up in a lot of young being produced, and could potentially help there be more young in the future. So perhaps unsurprisingly, multiple brooding was more common when their colonies weren't surrounded with human infrastructure. So when they weren't surrounded by other buildings, roads, parking lots, these are likely places where there aren't a lot of insects available, where the foraging locations are further away, and where disturbances could be more common. So the places that have a lot of this infrastructure around them, these probably are not going to be the ideal sites for barn swallows to be breeding. What I also found was that barn swallows really don't do well with gloomy springs. So I don't know if some of you will remember 2019, but that was the second year of my master's research. And it was an extremely cold and rainy springtime. We had, I would say, about maybe about 25% more days that were kind of cold and rainy than the preceding 3 or 4 years. And so what this does is it really delays the start of the breeding season. The barn swallows need to have good warm weather at the start of the breeding season so that insects can become active, and so they don't need to spend so much of their energy just keeping warm. And so using this information about when multiple brooding is more common, we can use that to help inform potential conservation decisions in the future. So if we look at what sites should be conserved, the ones that are in areas where the breeding starts earlier and where there are warmer days in the springtime, those are probably going to be the higher quality sites, as well as those that have more and field wetlands around them and not as much parking lots and roads. And so that is one aspect of looking at reproductive success that I did for my thesis. But what's interesting here is what I did here was look at how the conditions around a breeding site, how the environment around a breeding site will affect reproductive success. But that's not the only thing that will affect reproductive success. Something else we need to think of is what affects the conditions throughout the rest of their life cycle will have on their breeding. And this is important because barn swallows are only in the Maritimes for a few months every year. They spend a lot of time outside of our borders. in South America and along their migration. And what they experience there should likely have an impact on what happens to them up here. And so this is what Tara explored for her thesis as well, where she used those feather and blood samples to be able to look at what had happened to these barn swallows in the past in their non-breeding grounds in South America. And so the highlights of her research were that higher stress levels on the breeding ground resulted in barn swallows arriving to the Maritimes in worse body condition, and it also delayed breeding. And so not only are the barn swallows dependent on the environment at their breeding grounds, but the reproductive success and timing and a lot of what they experience up here is intrinsically linked to what's happening to them elsewhere in their range. This really highlights how we can't look at them in a bubble. And if we think about our swallows here, we really need to expand kind of the geographic area that we're looking at them and consider their whole life cycle. The logical kind of step to take from there is to ask, well, if the conditions on their non-breeding grounds are affecting their reproduction, where actually are they, like, where are these non-breeding grounds? So that was another question that Tara addressed in her thesis, where she used geolocators, which are special trackers that look at patterns in light levels to figure out where a bird is located, to figure out where the birds were spending the bulk of their winter times. And so you can see on the bottom the maps where the birds are likely located in 2 separate years, where the darker color represents the areas where they're most likely to be found. And so you see a bit of a shift between years, but in general, the barn swallows are spending their winters in kind of interior Brazil down through Paraguay and Argentina. These are kind of areas with a lot of grasslands, where they would also be closely tied to farm fields as well. So this is an important step forward to have for our understanding of the swallows here, because we had previously known that barn swallows, they winter down in South America, but a barn swallow from Vancouver, Kansas looks the same as a barn swallow from Nova Scotia. And so we want to know exactly what locations would be of interest for us if we want to kind of target conservation decisions down there, or if we want to look at kind of what changes have taken place there to try to figure out what happened to these swallows in the past. So this was a really important piece that Tara and her other co-authors in this paper added into our understanding of the swallows in the region. And lastly, I've talked a lot about kind of reproductive success and wintering locations, but there's one really critical component of the barn swallow life cycle that we need to consider, and that's survival. So So something that's really interesting about barn swallows is that the pair that you have perhaps nesting in your garage that comes back to the same nest year after year, that could very well be the exact same birds. Because adult barn swallows, once they breed at a site, they'll typically never leave to breed at another site. They really like to stick to where they know. And so what that means for us is that we can look at this banding data that we've collected over the years and get pretty good estimates about how good their survival and return rates are. Unfortunately, their survival really isn't great. Tara has been spearheading a project that we're in the process of getting published that looked at estimating survival rates, and we found that for female barn swallows, survival is only about 35%. And for males, it's about 43%. So fewer than half of the adults that you see in the springtime are returning for the following year. This isn't atypical of songbirds, but it's good to get a baseline level of where we're at and to have this understanding of what their survival is, to understand how their population changes and their demographics and whatnot. Now that, to be clear, is only survival of the adult swallows. If we look at the survival of chicks through their first year, that is an entirely different question. That is really hard to answer because unlike the adults, the chicks will not return to the site where they were born at or where they hatched at. They will almost always disperse from their kind of natal colony to another area, but we don't have a great understanding of how far those dispersal distances or where to look. And so our estimates of kind of that juvenile survival, that first year survival, are really estimates, but they're likely only about 16%. So very few of the swallows that are hatched are actually surviving to breed, and few actually survive beyond kind of their second year. Now that we do still see them survive until we saw at some of our breeding sites 5 or 6 year old or older swallows, but those are much less common than kind of 1 year old swallows. But having this information is really important to help inform our decisions and inform just kind of our general knowledge base about these impressive little birds. So I've talked about a lot of different research that's been happening, but really there are 3 main messages to take away from this. First of all, the barn swallow's environment is hugely influential. It's influential on their reproductive success, their behaviors, and it's not just their kind of immediate environment that is important, it's their environment that they experience throughout their whole life cycle. And along those same lines, to consider the conservation of these species, we really need to look beyond our borders and consider their whole life cycle. Lastly, it's fun to be creative with research methods to answer questions that could otherwise be really difficult to answer. Tracking technologies really open up a world of possibility with answering questions and being able to look at really complex physiological processes through looking at different tissues is really something that it opens up just so much possibility and so many questions that could be answered. But even with all this research, there are still a lot of questions that remain. First of all, that post-fledgling period is full of mysteries. So from that time that a swallow chick will leave the nest to when it's down in South America, we just really don't know a lot about it. We don't know how they are kind of leaving their natal site, how they're exploring the area, how they pick the spot where they're going to breed next year, how far they're moving. It's just a lot of questions during that period that they deserve a lot of attention. We also have questions about where mortality is occurring. This is something that would be really interesting to see more in the future about whether or not the post-fledgling period, the period immediately after leaving a nest is the most dangerous for a young swallow, but what about the adults? Are there particular areas where they're most at risk, and is there something we can do to alleviate that risk? And lastly, there's a lack of research on the success of different interventions that can be done for the conservation of the species. So one thing is the construction of artificial nesting sites. So you see on the right, this is, I don't know where this is located. It might be in PEI, but this is an example of a structure that has been built to try to attract barn swallows to nest there. So it kind of mimics what they would experience in a barn, but there isn't a lot of research to talk about, you know, how to make this most successful. And I think that a lot of the times the groups that have put these at haven't had the best of luck. But these could be a really important tool to, for example, replacing any like important nest sites that needed to be kind of knocked down for some reason. And so this is something that deserves more attention in the future. We also don't really have data about how like changing the landscape around a breeding site or introducing livestock or something, how that improves or worsens kind of barn swallow success at different colonies. And so that would be something that would also be very informative for different conservation measures and informing kind of management actions. And so I'll just end off this talk with a bit of advice about what you can do if you want to ensure that these birds are here for the future, and not just barn swallows, but also for birds more generally. So one thing you can do is you can be a good steward for the swallows and keep an eye on the nest from afar. So you really don't need to be looking in the nest with a mirror or like climbing up there with a ladder to know what's going on. You can really learn a lot by observing the nest from a distance if you're lucky enough to have one on your property or a place you go regularly. If you see an adult sitting on the nest, it's likely that they're incubating eggs. Or if you find eggshells below, you know that the nest is hatched. And once you start to see the chicks kind of overflowing the nest like this, you know that they're almost ready to go. And so this is a particular period of their life where you can play an important role in keeping an eye on them, because if they leave the nest before they're ready to really take part in before they're good flyers, then you might find them on the ground where they're very vulnerable. And so just keeping an eye out at their nesting sites around this stage can be a really important step to just making sure that they can be as successful as they can be. So that also leads us to cats. So I know cats can be a bit of a touchy subject, but it's impossible to talk about barn swallows without talking about the prevalence of barn cats around. That post-fledging stage, so as soon as the swallow leaves its nest, they're really just learning to fly, and sometimes they'll leave the nest early, especially if it's in a heat wave and they're really hot up in their nest. And so at this point, if they go on to the ground before they're capable of flight, the adult swallow would still continue to feed them, and they could in theory be successful, but they're extremely vulnerable to predation at that point. And especially I've come across a lot of young swallows that have been predated by cats. I know that it can be difficult, especially with having cats around a farm for rodent control, but I know, for example, one farm that I used to ride at, they kind of let their cat have a little vacation to a friend's home for a couple months around the barn swallow breeding period, so that they know that the swallows are safe, but they can still have the cat around for most of the year to help with the rodents and whatnot. Something to keep in mind. I would say it's also very helpful for you to encourage others to notice birds. This can be as simple as if you see a neat bird while walking along the salt marsh trail, just, grabbing some unsuspecting person and just being like, look at this, isn't this cool? This isn't supposed to be here. This is supposed to be thousands of kilometers away. I know that I've roped in a number of friends to learning facts, even if they don't necessarily want to learn them, but I think all of that, well, it has been successful. A friend of mine did buy her own pair of binoculars, so I do consider that a success. But just getting people to notice birds is really important, because if someone's able to kind of notice and see the difference between a starling and a barn swallow, then they might consider their relationship with those birds darting around their heads a bit differently. And also it is important to encourage and empower people who have not typically had the same access to the outdoors and to birding. We want to be the most welcoming birding community that we can be. And so encouraging and really giving the opportunity to minorities or
the fact of driving up the cost and the outlook down the road, we'll have that more later. We'll see to be back.
That can be a really important thing to do. And so programs like Diversity of Nature, which was started by some students at Dalhousie University. This is something that's working on getting youth, BIPOC youth into kind of field situations, taking them out scuba diving to learn about scientific diving, taking them out birding to be able to use binoculars for the first time. These are really valuable experiences that they will be able to have and will improve their ability to kind of be stewards of birds as well. You can also be an advocate for the species, especially for where they're nesting around Nova Scotia. I've heard from a number of different people who have approached kind of managers at that Rona store I previously mentioned to make sure that they're aware that they have swallows nesting there, and they just, you know, every year go and check on the store staff to make sure that they're allowing the doors to be open and making sure that the swallows aren't trapped. And that can be a really important step towards making sure that, you know, the swallows are set up for success. And lastly, a really important thing you can do is to support conservation, advocacy, and research. And you can do this through a lot of different groups in Nova Scotia. The Ecology Action Center does a lot of great work looking at, you know, like climate change advocacy and action in the province. Groups like the Nova Scotia Nature Trust and Nature Conservancy Canada are really valuable in preserving lands that are important habitats for a number of different bird species. MTRI, or Mercy Tobiatic Research Institute, I know is going to be starting up a program on barn swallows, and so I suspect that you'll be hearing more about that in the coming years as they figure out exactly what that's going to take shape to be. And Birds Canada is also a really fantastic resource and organization to support, and in particular, just want to highlight a couple of their programs. So we have Swift Watch, which chimney swifts, I'm sure many of you know about, but this Swift Watch is a great way to collect data on their roosts and to get involved in some citizen science. You can take part in Project Nest Watch, where you can actually contribute your monitoring of swallow nests and other birds' nests to potentially be used in like analyses in the future. And they've also had a program to have signs for swallow-friendly sites. You can see that on the right. And so this is a really good way to indicate that, you know, your swallow-friendly area, and you can kind of be a good steward and a good example for the community around. And I believe that next month, the aerial insectivore biologist for the Atlantic region, Graham, is going to be giving a talk about Swift Watch. So you can make sure to tune in and learn more about another aerial insectivore. And so with that, thanks everyone for listening. I'll be really happy to answer any questions you have or to hear about experiences you've had with swallows or observations you've had over the years of them in Nova Scotia. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. That was excellent. It is interesting to learn so much about barn swallows. I watch them quite frequently outside of Rona, and I know several people who have also been involved in approaching the Rona people and asking them. They're very approachable and willing to help to make sure that the barn swallows. I think that's really good advice. I had a question, and I'm sure other people have questions too, but I'll just start with my question. Do you think that the local pesticide bans that we're seeing, or herbicide bans that we're seeing in different municipalities, do you think that they're helpful for barn swallows?
I can't say I know too much about these local bans, but I think so. In general, there is pesticide use at a very large scale still. If we look at like spraying a forest, that there is still such a high pesticide presence in our general environment that those probably do help at kind of a local scale, especially if there are kind of wetlands or other important ecosystems in the vicinity, but it's hard to say. They definitely wouldn't hurt, but it's hard to say kind of specifically for swallows how much of a difference they would make.
And along that same line, Elizabeth or Beth Sherwood had a question about habitat loss or use of pesticides in their winter environment.
Yeah, there's really not a lot known about what's happened down there. I mean, there, just like there has been up in North America, there has been a lot of agricultural intensification and like conversion of wetland habitats in their wintering areas in South America, but it's really hard often to find the data for that, especially looking at different kind of jurisdictions and different regulations or lack of regulations that have existed. I mean, even here, it's really hard to kind of quantify the pesticide use, kind of a regional scale over the past 50 or so years.
Right, yeah.
But it's definitely something that, yeah, I hope that there's more work to look at what changes have really occurred down in South America, because that's something that hasn't really been done.
Okay. Andrew Hepta, if you'd like to take yourself off mute, I know Andrew has a question.
Yeah, hi, Hilary. Really interesting talk. It got me thinking about a bunch of stuff, including why our barn swallows disappeared from our farm. However, I want you to take 2 steps back and look at something else. I've been working on bats for about 50 years. And of course, we've had a major decline recently because of white nose syndrome. So we're running roughly on the mainland about 5% of the population that we have been recorded historically. And that got me thinking here is that with the construction of structures, so in other words, let's say, refer to it, even the Mi'kmaq had some structures, but certainly with the Acadians appearing in the early 17th century, we started producing these much higher quality nesting sites. And so using the bat analogy, we actually converted a populations of bats that were nesting in marginal sites, i.e. trees, hollow trees, potentially possibly caves and stuff like that, where success would be relatively minimal, to producing high quality roosting sites for the bats. And of course, my suspicion is that we had a massive increase in bat populations once we started creating these structures. And as you were talking and showing those pictures, it dawned on me that perhaps there's something parallel here, that with the construction of buildings and barns and other structures, we're providing many more high quality sites. And so we actually had an increase in numbers. And of course, we don't have any indication as to what the numbers were in 17th, 18th, even 19th century on these animals. And just as a note, there is no Mi'kmaq word for barn swallow. Okay, they do have a single swallow name. So I'm just wondering whether or not that may have actually masked the effects or the effects of other cultural activity that we were doing. And so in other words, the barn swallows may have been under much greater pressure, not just down in their overwintering habitats, but also here. And now those have been overcome by the So the success based on high quality sites has been overcome by other pressures altogether. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a really excellent point to make. It's a really important point that we've had a lot of conversations about, because it is like very widely accepted that barn swallow populations like really exploded. They were like really high in the kind of 70s, the mid 1900s, when compared to kind of pre-settlement in North America. And so you're exactly right. We did create this environment where suddenly they had a lot more habitat available to nest in, and it really it allowed them to proliferate. It's much like how bobolinks also we kind of artificially made really great habitat for them, and then now we're running into issues because as we change our practices, this is really having a huge impact on these bird species. And so for something like barn swallows, it's a bit of a like what's called an ecological trap, where we created these really great nesting habitats for them, and now they really associate these barns with a high quality nest site where they generally have really good success. If we think to the old style barns that have like shingles or kind of metal sheeting with a layer of wood underneath, and then the swallows would nest under there. What we're seeing a lot now is the newer kind of style of barn is just like a sheet metal roof, and the barn swallows end up nesting immediately under that roof. And so this is actually resulting in a fair bit of trouble. It's something that we observed at a number of our sites, because we would put temperature loggers up by the nests in these areas, and on warm sunny days they would get up in like close to 50 degrees Celsius. And so this is an instance where, for example, one day we went into a barn, and of 5 nests were active in there with chicks, and the chicks from 4 out of 5 of those nests had jumped out when they still needed to be in their nests for about another week or so. And so it is something that is definitely a problem. But it does also bring up the point of, well, what are we trying to bring back these swallow populations to? Is it to what kind of we create, the levels that we created with our actions, or is it to kind of the levels that we observed, and well, that we didn't observe, but that were around previously? Yeah.
Thanks, Hilary. Thomas Baker has a question.
Thanks, Hilary, for the great presentation. Also, that was a great question too, Andrew. Really interesting things, and I might jump off that a bit. Is it possible, Hilary, to open up your presentation again?
Yeah.
I think it's one of the early slides, the one where you show the two, I think it's from the breeding bird atlas of the 2 bits of the Maritimes. Because that really jumped out at me.
Yeah. Let me go back. Yeah, it's quite the difference between the 2 atlases.
What were the years for that? Okay, here we go. Because I was surprised by the left map. I never really, I guess, being the age I am and having lived, not having lived at all between 1986 and 1990, I've always associated barn swallows as not really, like I never would have thought of them as that generalist, that like covering so much land. I think of them as living like in the Annapolis Valley or like other farmland areas. So, and I guess looking at this changeover, it really looks like they've held on a lot, mostly in agricultural lands. So you have the Annapolis River Valley, you have kind of the Musquodoboit area and into up towards Truro, and you have Tantramar area, Antigonish, Pictou, and they're really being lost from more of the remote, maybe even more, I guess, especially in New Brunswick, the more boreal kind of areas, or in like central Southwest Nova. So I guess my question is just kind of generally about why we think we see those trends. Like I'm thinking like, were there used to be farms out there that have slowly been falling apart, like kind of old small farmsteads, or is it like do they use, like, I know swifts do they use old growth dead trees? Like, would this also be something to do with forestry, that we no longer have old growth forests through a lot of those areas? I guess just any thoughts on that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the barn swallows really don't use forested habitats very much. They don't nest in trees at all. Their natural nest sites would be, I mean, they could have been along like riverbanks or coastal areas and caves. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point because I mean, I also wasn't really around to see what the populations of barn swallows were like in the 80s. And I'm sure that there are some people on this call who could provide some really interesting insight. But I do suspect that what has happened is that there really has been a dramatic decline in the number of farms. So I think the Census of Agriculture showed something like a 70% decline in the number of farms with cattle between approximately this, well, I think it was 1970 to 2010. And so there has been a big shift away from, well, like farms of cattle are ones that we generally would think of as like really high quality. It's generally a pretty good source of insect populations. And I suspect that they were kind of a bit more scattered, but also maybe there was something back in the 80s where the swallows were just generally better equipped to breed or be found in areas that we would think of as kind of like subpar habitats now. So maybe there were conditions that, yeah, just like made them better equipped to handle conditions that now they just really can't. But yeah, I'm not too sure what has happened there, and I haven't really talked to many people about the first breeding bird atlas, but it has also been something that I've found quite striking, just how widespread they used to be.
Yeah, and that I was also thinking that too, that like maybe back then the population was so saturated that they were leaking into lower quality habitats, whereas now they're really only constrained to the higher quality areas. Yeah, no, this was just really striking to me. I didn't think it was that big a jump in such a short amount of time of range. Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and you can see just in the chat, I know I can see that Jocelyn and Elizabeth have some anecdotes and about like changes that they've observed in barn swallow nesting. And it's something that I've heard from a lot of people, including the people whose farms that we still visit who have swallows. They would talk about how when they were kids growing up on this farm, who these people are now in their 70s, that they would just have swallows in the summer just lining like between 10 power poles. And now, even though it's like a very successful site with barn tree and cliff swallows with like 20 barn swallow pairs, it's nowhere close to what they used to see.
Yeah, it's a very interesting mystery. Thanks, Hilary.
Yeah, thanks, Alice.
Amy Russell has a question. Amy, if you could come off mute and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for this. My question is surrounding using cat bibs. I don't know if you're familiar with them. I learned about them at Hope for Wildlife, and they're to help prevent outdoor cats from predating birds, because often bells on their collars can actually impact their safety from their predators. But are you familiar with the cat bibs and if they might help with predation on fledglings?
Are they similar to like scrunchies that will sometimes go around cats' necks to be more visible?
I'm not sure about the scrunchies, but it does look like a bib, like a baby's bib, but for cats.
Okay.
So it keeps it quiet, but it makes it harder for them to kill birds.
Well, something to keep in mind is any bird that, well, any chick or any bird that is recently fledged is just very vulnerable. They don't really have the ability to escape, so cats don't need to sneak up on them. They could just walk up, and there isn't really any protection that the young bird has. So all of the kind of deterrents for cat predation, like bells or all those other things that are made, like those really don't actually help with the predation of young. Those would be maybe sometimes successful with the predation of adult birds, but for the young that have no ability to flee, it wouldn't really make a difference.
Yeah, I didn't think it might, but I was just curious if maybe it did give them a chance.
Yeah, unfortunately, they are quite defenseless on the ground. And it can take a few days before the swallows are kind of able to have powered flight, and especially to be able to take off is challenging, or sometimes you'll see them trying to land somewhere after they've just started to fly, and they kind of like flutter up against a wall or after trying to land, but they just like really, it takes a bit of time for them to learn the skills, and in that time they are very vulnerable. I think that what is it? More than half of the mortality, maybe it's like 70% of the mortality that happens in the first year occurs in the week after leaving the nest.
Wow, that's that's really significant.
Yeah, it's a significant amount because it's just a very vulnerable period of time for them.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.
Oh, thanks. Does anyone have any fun anecdotes about barn swallows, growing up with them, getting dive bombed by them? Any barn swallow rescues that you've had to do before? I will say one thing. So when we found those barn swallow chicks on the ground after being kind of prematurely fledged because of the heat, what we ended up doing was taking some cardboard boxes and taping them to the rafters, and putting a bit of nesting material inside so that they were about a meter lower from the roof than the original nest were, so still around the nest but not as close to the roof. And it was actually quite successful. The chicks did survive for a few more days and were getting fed, but unfortunately what ended up happening was a raccoon came and walked along the rafters and ate all the chicks. So you know, there's a lot of kind of tricks to trying to help them, but sometimes it can be tough.
Hilary, Andrew has a follow-up question, so I'll just let Andrew take himself off mute.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. Yeah, actually, something that Thomas said actually rang a bit of a bell, and that is, are the populations now perhaps reflective of what they were before contact, before settlement? And if that's the case, or if they're similar, if that's the case, are our conservation priorities and directions appropriate for either recovering, you know, what are we trying to recover to? We're trying to recover to the Father Knows Best 1950s numbers, or are we trying to recover to what the historical numbers are?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of one of the biggest questions, and if there's ever kind of any debate that we've had in the lab, or if we ever want to kind of set up a discussion with another lab, that's one of the biggest questions that we bring up, because I mean, is there a right answer? Like, probably not. I mean, one thing to consider is that the population that we have now is like completely different from the population that we would have had previously. There's essentially no natural nesting happening in the Maritimes right now. I think in the Maritime Nest Records Scheme, there's 5 natural nest records out of probably close to 3,000 nest records now. And I think a lot of those would have been from quite a long time ago. So yeah, it's a tough question because the population numbers that we have out here now likely are kind of higher than what they would have been when they were just nesting on kind of cliff faces and in caves. But there still is, well, I think one thing to consider is that they can act as a bit of a like canary in the coal mine, a bit of an indicator species, because even if their populations, if we don't pay too much attention to those numbers, their declines are likely indicative of things happening in the ecosystems that are affecting more than just them. So other swallow species that would have been more common, things like swifts that have lost a lot of habitat because of like old growth logging, but are also similarly affected by kind of loss in insect prey and other birds that are in decline because of loss of wetland habitat. So yeah, their conservation can kind of be kind of more about what they say about ecosystem health, and we don't always need to consider kind of what we're aiming for. Just we can aim for better.
That's a good point. Thanks, Hilary. Elizabeth Walsh would like to ask a question. Elizabeth, can you take yourself off mute? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Oh, I guess I could also put my camera on so you can see me. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. Anyways, kind of a follow-up question to what Andrew had. So everyone knows that insectivorous birds are definitely on decline. We know that in North America. However, the ICUN or IUCN has listed barn swallows as least concern. So I guess I'm just wondering, do you have any information on what trends are being found like elsewhere in the globe where barn swallows are found, like where, say in Europe, they would have had settlement way before us. So definitely those artificial nesting structures available to them way sooner than we had. So I'm just wondering, are they seeing similar declines? I'm assuming that maybe not, or otherwise the international designation would be a little bit more elevated than least concern. And sorry, I have two screens, so that's why I'm off to the side. So.
I spend a lot of time on Zoom calls. Yeah, so the short answer is that it's incredibly varied region to region, continent to continent. Everywhere there are pockets where the barn swallows have experienced dramatic declines. There's places in Europe where there have been like 60-70% declines. There's places where they've been relatively stable. Even if we look in Canada or in North America in general, there's been actually some increases in their population noted in Saskatchewan over the last 10 years. And in general, if we look back to 1970, I think, where is it? There's some areas in North America, in the States, where they didn't actually experience any decline. So a lot of it, yeah, it varies so much. Part of the reason why the IUCN has them listed as a species of least concern is just that the metrics that they use to assess are, it's really hard for a very abundant species to be listed as endangered or threatened. And because there haven't necessarily been universal declines, it hasn't kind of gone beyond species of least concern. But yeah, in general, that's because it's just like so highly abundant and there hasn't really been that much range constriction throughout the world on their populations.
Sarah has a question.
Not really a question, but you were asking about stories. When I was growing up, my grandfather's farm had barn swallows, and they were really neat to watch. And this summer at Keji, there was barn swallows nesting at the kayak rental place. And they're like right on the building, right up, you know, in all the busyness. And the staff said that they were actually there the year before too. And they would dive bomb people. They were pretty, anyway, I think they roped off an area, but then they're back again this year and they're more tolerant of the people, which I thought was pretty interesting and really shows that they come back, the same pairs probably coming back each year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's
that's really, it's always impressive the kind of level of disturbance that they can kind of tolerate. I know the barn I used to ride at, the swallows nested right above the main door where there were probably like 50 people coming through every day and horses coming in and out. They were quite happy there. But it was always interesting while we were monitoring the swallows because, you know, myself and Becky and Katie would be going to the nest fairly frequently, and we were like measuring chicks as well as part of our research. And so we would occasionally be removing the chicks from the nest temporarily. The swallows definitely were less tolerant of us than they were of the landowners, who would just generally be in and out, you know, just doing their thing. So was yeah, I think they came to kind of hate us, but still they did well.
Yeah, maybe a natural selection thing. Jocelyn Coates, if you'd like to, Jocelyn would like to speak as well.
Hello. That was just as I guess story again, as indicated in your comment before. Where I grew up, we had this garage that was always open because it didn't have any proper doors, and they just loved that. And plus, great barn that we had, huge. And every May, about mid-May, we always knew. And my mother would say, "I keep looking. I'm looking for my swallows." My mother. And she'd look out and they literally came up and flew by the house windows and would do all kinds of acrobatics, it seemed, and then go to the garage. It was like, we're back, we're here, we're letting you know. It was kind of a wonderful thing every year. And yes, they were pretty aggressive with the cats. They would die. Certain cats were really pretty. They would dive bomb and do different things. And one of our dogs at one time. And so they were pretty gun shy of the swallows. They were pretty nervous. So it was always an interesting spring. Every year in the spring, my mother said, "It's spring, the swallows are back." So just thought I'd share that. We lived near the Tantramar marshes. And so we had lots of mosquitoes, lots of things for them to eat. This is a farm. And again, now our house is gone. Everything is gone from there, the family farm. And so they have nowhere to go.
Yeah. Yeah, the Tantramar region is where I was based for, that's really where a lot of the research was concentrated, and being able to talk to so many people around there who have seen the changes, I mean, you may have been around when there were a lot more marsh barns around, but now, you know, there's like that one here and one there, and even just the number of other barns that are kind of falling down in the area. But it's really neat to talk to people around there and just hear about all the stories of swallows from growing up. And it's also really lovely. One of the best things about working with, I forgot one thing. When I was saying thank you, really want to thank all of the landowners, because they were absolutely critical to the success of all this research, and just like so welcoming to often having us like trapezing around their properties at like 3 a.m. to go catch birds. So just like the most wonderful people, and I'll still call them up to this day and kind of get updates on what the swallows are doing this year and hear how things are going. And yeah, it's really wonderful part of working with the swallows. And yeah.
And that's really a great example of how researchers make a difference, that raising peoples who are hosting these birds in their farms, raising their awareness of what's important, like why metal roofs, how they affect the unintended impacts of things like metal roofs or other changes that they make. So it's a really important contribution that you've made, Hilary. Thank you.
Well, and I mean, I was just
So
saying, I've learned so much from them as well. Like the Roland, who owns one of the farms, the farmer that there's that metal roof. He kept trying all sorts of different things to try to that help with that. He would screw things onto the outside of the roof to try to create more of an insulative layer, and like try all sorts of different things just to try to make the roof a bit better for the swallows, and to be able to see that and just like hear about, you know, they have spent a lot more time watching these swallows than I have, and so
yes,
always
yeah,
have more to learn from
yeah.
them.
They develop their own expertise. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're out of questions. There are a few other comments in the chat, many comments thanking you and noting what an excellent presentation. So thank you again, Hilary.
Oh, thank you very much.
Any last minute comments, folks?
I hope you see lots of swallows this year.
Yeah. Yeah, we usually go over to McNabb's Island and check if there's the forts there. And I've only been birding, maybe 10 years, but actually going to McNabb's Island to look at them for about 10 years. And I noticed a decline. And it's certainly not the buildings. It may be insects, but there just seems to be fewer and fewer every time I go.
Yeah, I mean, someone may know about this more specifically than me, but I know also on McNabb's a few years back, some people went during the breeding season and knocked down a bunch of nests in one of the structures. And so it actually like destroyed a bunch of eggs and killed some chicks. And so that is likely something that also contributed to those local declines that you see there. But yeah, so.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a relatively very few people go there, but more so, I guess, in recent years because there's camping over there now. But yeah, and there are signs there asking people to protect the nests and to make sure. I knew they were boarded up at one point and then reopened, but I didn't know they knocked them down. That's pretty sad.
Yeah, but I think there's now some maybe artificial like nest cups out there, or they've put out some little platforms for them to build on. I think that Friends of McNabb's and Canadian Wildlife Service, maybe a combination of the two, I'm not sure. I think that they've done a bit of work there, or at least they were back in like 2017, which I guess is a few years ago now.
Yeah, time flies. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's attendance, and I will send out an email with the information about the Blue Mountain. And some other details, any other details that I can come up with that I think are worth sharing with the members in the next few days. Thank you all. Good night.